The tri-state tornado of 1925 was not like any storm before it. To understand what happened on that Wednesday afternoon, you have to imagine a world without weather radar, without emergency alerts, without any warning at all. On March 18, 1925, the people of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana woke up to a day that felt strange. The air was thick and heavy, almost like summer had arrived early. The temperature climbed into the 60s by mid-morning, then into the 70s by noon, which was unheard of for March in the Midwest. The sky had a greenish tint, a color that farmers sometimes called an old bruise, but most people paid it no mind. They had chores to do, crops to plant, trains to catch, children to send off to school. It was just another day in the heartland, and no one had any reason to think it would be their last. The storm system that would produce the deadliest tornado in American history began far to the west, over the Rocky Mountains. A powerful upper-level disturbance pushed eastward, dragging warm, moist air up from the Gulf of Mexico. That warm air collided with a cold front sweeping down from Canada. The ingredients were perfect for severe weather, but no one knew it yet. By late morning, the first thunderstorms erupted over eastern Kansas and western Missouri. These were not ordinary storms. They were supercells, rotating monsters that fed on the unstable air. One of them, near the town of Ellington in southeastern Missouri, began to spin more violently than the others. Around 1:00 p.m., a funnel cloud dipped down from the base of that storm. It touched the ground just a few miles west of the small community of Ellington, and it did not lift again for 3.5 hours. The first sign of trouble came as a roar. It was not like thunder, which rumbles and fades. This was a steady, grinding noise like 1,000 freight trains rolling through a tunnel. People who heard it later described it as a vibration that they felt in their chests before they heard it with their ears. The tornado moved at an average speed of 62 miles per hour, which is faster than most cars on a country road back then. It did not wander or skip. It ran in a straight line, almost due east, for 219 miles. It carved a path that was, on average, 3/4 of a mile wide. In some places, it was over a mile wide. Nothing in the recorded history of weather had ever behaved like this. The first casualties were in Missouri. The tornado swept through the rural areas around Ellington and Annapolis, tearing apart farmhouses and barns. It killed 33 people in Missouri, most of them farmers who had no time to reach a cellar. The tornado was so large and moving so fast that even if they saw it coming, there was nowhere to run. One farmer, a man named John Cole, was working in his field when the sky turned black. He later said he heard the roar and looked up to see a wall of debris that stretched from the ground to the clouds. It did not look like a funnel. It looked like a solid black mountain moving at him. He threw himself into a shallow ditch and covered his head. The wind ripped the clothes off his body and pelted him with gravel and splinters. When it passed, he looked up and saw that his house was gone, his barn was gone, his livestock were gone. He was alive, but he was alone in a field that had been scoured clean. The tornado crossed the Mississippi River near the town of Gorham, Illinois, around 2:30 p.m. It was now over an hour old and still gaining strength. The river did not slow it down. The funnel lifted briefly over the water, then slammed back down on the Illinois side with even more fury. The first town in its path was Gorham itself, a small mining community of about 800 people. The tornado hit Gorham at full force. Every building in the town was destroyed. The schoolhouse collapsed with children still inside. The hotel was flattened. The train depot was torn apart. When rescuers finally made it into town, they found bodies scattered in the streets and in the fields. The death toll in Gorham was 34, but that number would be eclipsed many times over in the next hour. The tornado then plowed into the town of Murfreesboro, Illinois, a city of about 12,000 people. Murfreesboro was a railroad town, a center for coal mining and trade. It had a downtown with brick buildings, a high school, a hospital, and several factories. The tornado struck at 2:38 p.m., just as the afternoon shift was starting at the coal mines and children were finishing their school day. The funnel was now a mile wide. It came from the southwest and cut a swath through the heart of the city. The first building to go was the Murfreesboro High School, a large 3-story brick structure. The roof was torn off, the walls collapsed inward, and the entire building crumbled like a sandcastle. There were about 300 students inside at the time. The teachers had no warning. One teacher, a woman named Ethel Harris, was reading a poem to her class when she heard the roar. She shouted for the children to get under their desks, but it was too late. The building came down on top of them. Miraculously, many survived, but 17 students were killed and dozens were injured. The tornado continued through the business district. The Hotel Shawnee, a 4-story building that was considered the finest in southern Illinois, was reduced to a pile of bricks. The lobby was full of guests and travelers who had stopped for lunch. None of them had any chance. The depot downtown, the power plant, the furniture factory, the churches, all gone. The storm knocked over oil tanks and gas lines, sparking fires that spread through the rubble. By the time the tornado had passed, Murfreesboro had lost 234 of its residents. 400 more were injured. The city was unrecognizable. One survivor, a man named Frank Wiggins, crawled out from under a collapsed wall and walked down the street. He said later that the street was gone. There were no buildings, no trees, no pavement, just piles of wood and brick and mud with bodies mixed in. He could not find a single landmark to tell him where he was. West Frankfort, Illinois was the next major town in the path. It was another mining community, even larger than Murfreesboro, with a population of about 16,000. The tornado hit West Frankfort just minutes after leaving Murfreesboro around 2:45 p.m. The people here had a little more warning because some of the debris from Murfreesboro was falling on their town before the storm arrived. But a warning of 2 or 3 minutes is not enough when the tornado is moving at over 60 miles per hour. The storm ripped through the southern edge of West Frankfort, destroying entire neighborhoods. It struck the West Frankfort High School, which was still in session. The building was made of brick and stone, but the tornado peeled off the roof and collapsed the upper floors. Students were trapped under tons of rubble. Parents ran to the school digging with their bare hands. 18 students died in that school, along with 2 teachers. Across West Frankfort, the death toll reached 148. The tornado was now at its peak. It had been on the ground for nearly 2 hours and had covered over 100 miles. It was not weakening. It was still a mile wide and still carrying debris that had been picked up in Missouri, some of it now flying at speeds of 200 miles per hour or more. There are stories from this part of the tornado's journey that seem almost impossible. Pieces of lumber were driven through brick walls like nails. A school desk from Murfreesboro was found 60 miles away in a field. A woman was picked up and carried for a quarter of a mile and landed softly, unharmed. Another man was thrown into a tree and impaled by a branch. The tornado did not discriminate. It killed rich and poor, old and young, saints and sinners alike. Just east of West Frankfort, the tornado passed through the small town of DeSoto, Illinois. DeSoto was a quiet village of about 600 people, known mostly for its orchards and farms. The tornado struck the DeSoto School, a 2-story frame building where 86 children were attending classes. The building was not built to withstand any kind of storm, let alone a mile-wide tornado. The teacher, a woman named Minnie Hawking, heard the roar and saw the windows bulge inward. She screamed for the children to get under their desks. The roof lifted off and flew away. The walls exploded outward. The floor collapsed. When the storm passed, the school was a pile of splinters. 33 of the 86 children were dead. The rest were scattered across the schoolyard, many of them injured. Parents rushed to the scene and began searching through the wreckage. One father found his son alive under a pile of desks. Another mother found her daughter dead, still clutching a pencil in her hand. The tornado continued east, leaving a trail of destruction that stretched from one horizon to the other. It hit the town of Hearst, then Bush, then Cambria, each community reduced to kindling. In the coal mining camps, the company houses were demolished. Miners who had just come up from the shaft were killed as they walked home. The tornado was so wide that it sometimes engulfed entire towns at once. There was no edge where the wind was weaker. Everywhere within the funnel was pure devastation. As the tornado crossed from Franklin County into Hamilton County, it began to enter more rural territory. But that did not mean fewer deaths. Families living on isolated farms had no warning at all. The tornado picked up barns and houses and tossed them into the air like toys. It stripped the bark off trees. It killed livestock by the hundreds. It changed the very shape of the land, scouring topsoil from fields and leaving behind a barren, gouged earth that looked like a battlefield. By 3:00 p.m., the tornado had been on the ground for 2 hours and had killed over 500 people. But it was not done. It was still moving east, still maintaining its terrible strength, and it was heading straight for Indiana. The residents of that state had no idea what was coming. They had heard rumors of a bad storm in Illinois, but word traveled slowly in 1925. There were no radio broadcasts, no television reports, no cell phone alerts. A few telegrams were sent, but they arrived too late or were never delivered. The towns of Indiana were about to face the same nightmare. The first community in Indiana to feel the tornado was Griffin, a small town of about 500 people. The tornado struck around 3:15 p.m. Griffin was hit so hard that the entire business district was flattened. The school was destroyed, but most of the children had already left for the day. 4 people died in Griffin. The tornado then hit the town of Patronville, killing 7. It continued through the countryside, destroying farms and killing families. In all, Indiana would lose 71 people that day. The tornado finally began to weaken as it approached the town of Boonville, Indiana. It had been on the ground for 3.5 hours and had traveled 219 miles. It had killed 695 people and injured over 2,000. It had destroyed thousands of buildings and left tens of thousands homeless. Near Boonville, the funnel started to lift. It became ragged and thin, and then it dissipated like a giant hand that had finally unclenched. The roar faded away, and a strange silence fell over the land. In the aftermath, survivors stumbled out of cellars and ditches and looked at what was left of their world. There were no roads, no landmarks, no familiar shapes. The sky was still dark with dust and debris. The air smelled of mud, splintered wood, and gas. The first rescuers arrived hours later, traveling by foot and horseback because the roads were impassable. They found bodies in trees, bodies in creeks, bodies buried under piles of debris. They found people wandering in a daze, their faces blank, their clothes torn. They found babies crying in fields, their parents gone. The scale of the tragedy was so immense that it took days to even count the dead. The tri-state tornado of 1925 remains the deadliest tornado in United States history. It was not just a storm. It was a monster that reshaped the landscape and the lives of everyone it touched. And it happened on a day that began like any other, warm and quiet, with no warning at all. As the sun began to set on that Wednesday, March 18, 1925, the survivors of the tri-state tornado faced a night unlike any they had ever known. There was no electricity, no running water, no telephones. The roads were gone, replaced by tangled fields of debris. People wandered through the ruins, calling out the names of their loved ones. Some heard faint cries and dug toward them. Others heard nothing at all. The silence was broken only by the occasional groan of wood settling, the whimper of a lost dog, or the distant sound of a steam whistle from a coal mine that was still standing. In Murfreesboro, the bodies were laid out in a row on the ground near the railroad depot, covered with tarps and blankets. Volunteers worked by lantern light, trying to identify the dead. Many were unrecognizable. Their faces were bruised and swollen, their clothes torn away. Families walked past the line of bodies, holding up lanterns, searching for a familiar shoe, a piece of jewelry, a birthmark. Some found what they were looking for and collapsed in grief. Others did not find them that night, or the next night, or the night after that. They would spend weeks combing the countryside, looking for the missing. In West Frankfort, the high school had become a makeshift hospital. The gymnasium floor was covered with wounded people lying on blankets and coats. Doctors came from nearby towns, traveling by car and buggy over roads that were still passable. They worked through the night, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, amputating limbs with little more than a pocket knife and a bottle of whiskey for anesthesia. The smell of blood and antiseptic filled the air. Outside, men dug through the rubble of the school, still looking for bodies. They found a teacher pinned under a steel beam, dead. They found two students huddled together in a closet, alive but bruised. They found a boy who had been thrown into the playground and covered with bricks. His classmates could only identify him by the red sweater he was wearing. In DeSoto, the school had been completely destroyed. The children who survived were taken to nearby homes where they sat in silence, staring at the walls. Some did not speak for days, others cried uncontrollably. The parents who had lost their children wandered from house to house, hoping against hope that someone had made a mistake. One mother walked 5 miles to the next town carrying a photograph of her daughter, asking everyone she met if they had seen her. She never did. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The warm air of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a cold wind that blew through the shattered homes. Survivors huddled together for warmth, wrapped in whatever they could find. They burned furniture in bonfires, the flames casting eerie shadows on the piles of rubble. Children clung to their parents, shivering. The elderly, some of them rescued from collapsed houses, sat wrapped in coats and blankets, staring into the flames as if seeing the faces of the dead. The next morning, the full scale of the disaster became apparent. Reporters from St. Louis, Chicago, and even New York arrived by train, then by foot to survey the damage. They walked through the wreckage, taking notes and photographs. They described the scene as resembling a war zone. In Murfreesboro, the main street was gone. Where buildings had stood, there were only foundations and piles of brick. A large safe from a bank lay on its side in the middle of the street, its door torn off. A grand piano had been carried 2 blocks and dropped on a pile of lumber. A child's doll lay in a tree, its dress torn and dirty. The reporters interviewed survivors who told stories of miraculous escapes and unimaginable losses. An old woman said she had been lifted into the air and carried 100 yards, landing in a field without a scratch. A young man told of watching his wife and children being swept away from him, never to be seen again. These stories were printed in newspapers across the country, and for the first time the American public began to understand the horror that had occurred. But the recovery was just beginning. In the days that followed, relief efforts poured in from all over the region. The Red Cross sent teams of nurses and volunteers. The National Guard was called out to help with search and rescue. Trains arrived loaded with food, clothing, and medical supplies. People from towns that had been spared brought what they could spare: blankets, canned goods, shovels. The federal government under President Calvin Coolidge did little at first. In 1925, there was no federal emergency management agency, no disaster relief funding. Communities had to rely on themselves and on the kindness of strangers. In Murfreesboro, the city council met in a tent. They set up a morgue in a vacant warehouse where volunteers washed and prepared the bodies for burial. The smell of death hung over the town. People wore cloths over their faces to block the odor. The dead were buried in mass graves because there were not enough coffins and not enough able-bodied men to dig individual graves. In one cemetery, a long trench was dug with a steam shovel. The bodies were laid side by side, wrapped in sheets or blankets and covered with lime. A minister said a prayer over the trench, and then the dirt was pushed in. It was a scene that would repeat itself across the region. In West Frankfort, a similar mass grave was dug. In DeSoto, the children were buried together in a corner of the local cemetery, their small coffins stacked in the ground. The survivors faced a long and difficult road. Many had lost everything, their homes, their possessions, their families. They had no money, no jobs, no place to go. Coal mines in the area were damaged and would not reopen for weeks. Farmers found their fields stripped of topsoil, their barns gone, their livestock dead. Some families moved away unable to bear the memories. Others stayed determined to rebuild. They built new houses out of whatever materials they could salvage. They planted new crops. They started new businesses. But the psychological scars remained. Survivors spoke of the sound, that terrible roar that haunted their dreams. They flinched at the sound of thunder. They kept a close eye on the sky whenever a storm approached. The tri-state tornado also prompted changes in the way Americans thought about weather forecasting and disaster preparedness. Before 1925, there was no organized system for issuing tornado warnings. The U.S. Weather Bureau, as it was then called, was reluctant to use the word tornado in its forecasts, fearing it would cause panic. After the disaster, that policy began to change. Meteorologists studied the storm's path and behavior, trying to understand why it had been so powerful and so long-lasting. They discovered that the tornado had been part of a massive supercell thunderstorm, a type of storm that was not yet well understood. They also realized that the tornado had stayed on the ground for so long because it was moving at speeds that matched the path of the storm's circulation. It was a rare and deadly combination. In the decades that followed, the tri-state tornado became a benchmark for all other tornadoes. It was studied by students of meteorology, used as a worst-case scenario in disaster planning. Its death toll of 695 would never be surpassed, though improved warning systems and building codes would make such a tragedy less likely. But the people who lived through it never forgot. They passed down the stories to their children and grandchildren. They held memorial services every year. They built monuments in the towns that were hit, listing the names of the dead. One of the most poignant monuments was erected in Griffin, Indiana, where 4 people had died. It was a simple stone with an inscription, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the tornado of March 18, 1925. In Murfreesboro, a bronze plaque was placed on the wall of the high school that had been rebuilt. It read, "This building is dedicated to the memory of the students and teachers who perished in the tornado." In DeSoto, a small park was created where the school had once stood. Benches and trees were planted, and a sign told the story of the 33 children who died there. But the most lasting legacy of the tri-state tornado was not in stone or bronze. It was in the resilience of the people who survived. They rebuilt their towns, raised their children, and went on with their lives. They did not forget, but they did not let the tragedy define them. They held dances in the new community halls. They cheered at baseball games on the new fields. They filled the new churches and schools with laughter and song. The tornado had taken much from them, but it had not taken their spirit. And in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all. As the years passed, the memory of the tri-state tornado faded from the national consciousness. New disasters took its place: hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. But for the people of the tri-state region, it remained a defining moment. They told the story to their grandchildren, who told it to their great-grandchildren. The story became part of the local lore, a tale of survival and loss that bound the communities together. And so, on a warm spring day when the air feels heavy and the sky turns green, you might see someone in Murfreesboro or West Frankfort or DeSoto glance up and listen. They are listening for that sound, that low rumble, that distant roar. They know what it means. They remember what happened on that day in 1925. And they hope that someday no one else will have to experience such a thing again. That is the hope that keeps them standing. That is the hope that keeps them watching the sky. But the story of the tri-state tornado did not end with the last body buried or the final prayer spoken over a mass grave. In the years that followed, the survivors carried the weight of that day with them, a weight that shaped everything they did. The towns that had been destroyed did not simply rebuild as they were. They rebuilt differently. They built stronger. They built with the memory of the storm etched into every brick and every beam. In Murfreesboro, the new high school was constructed with a reinforced basement designed to serve as a storm shelter. In West Frankfort, the city council passed an ordinance requiring all new public buildings to have a designated safe room. These were small steps, but they were the first of their kind in the nation. The tornado had taught a brutal lesson, and the people of the tri-state region were determined not to forget it. The coal mines, which had been the economic backbone of so many of these towns, took months to reopen. When they did, the miners returned to work with a new sense of caution. They had seen what the storm could do, and they knew that the underground tunnels offered little protection from the fury of the sky. Many miners began carrying whistles with them, a habit they picked up from the rescue workers who had used them to signal for help. If a storm approached, they would blow their whistles and the sound would echo through the shafts, warning everyone to take cover. It was a simple system, but it saved lives. The farmers faced an even longer road. The topsoil that had been ripped away by the tornado would take years to rebuild. The crops that had been planted that spring were lost, and many families faced the winter with empty pantries. The Red Cross and other relief organizations distributed seeds and tools, but the land itself had been scarred. Some farmers gave up and moved west to places like California and Texas where the weather was kinder. But many stayed, working the soil with their bare hands if they had to, determined to make the land fruitful again. And slowly, over the course of several seasons, the fields began to recover. The grass grew back. The wheat rose from the dirt. The livestock was replaced. By the end of the decade, the farms of southern Illinois and Indiana were producing again, though the farmers themselves were never the same. The psychological toll of the disaster was perhaps the most difficult to measure. In the weeks and months after the tornado, reports of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder began to surface, though no one used that term at the time. People reported vivid nightmares, anxiety attacks, and a persistent sense of dread. Some survivors refused to go outside when the sky was cloudy. Others could not bear to hear the sound of wind. Children who had lost their parents were placed in orphanages or taken in by relatives, but many of them struggled to adjust. They would sit quietly for hours staring at nothing, or they would cry without warning. The local schools hired counselors, but there were not enough trained professionals to help everyone, so the communities turned to each other. Neighbors took in the orphans. Churches organized support groups. People shared their stories not because they wanted to relive the horror, but because they needed to know that they were not alone. One of the most remarkable aspects of the recovery was the role played by women. In the aftermath of the tornado, it was the women who organized the relief efforts, who cooked the meals, who washed the bodies, who comforted the grieving. They worked tirelessly, often without recognition. In Murfreesboro, a group of women formed the Ladies' Relief Society, which raised money to build a new hospital. In West Frankfort, the Women's Club converted an old church into a shelter for displaced families. These women were not elected officials or military leaders, but they were the backbone of the recovery. Their efforts were chronicled in local newspapers, but rarely in the national press. Still, they knew what they had done, and they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The tri-state tornado also had a profound impact on the way the United States government approached disaster response. In the years following the storm, there was a growing recognition that the federal government needed to play a more active role in helping communities recover from natural disasters. The Red Cross had done heroic work, but it was a private organization and its resources were limited. In 1927, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, which provided federal funds for flood prevention and disaster relief. This was a direct response to the devastation caused by the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, but it also drew on lessons learned from the tri-state tornado. Slowly, the idea of a federal disaster relief agency began to take shape, though it would be decades before FEMA was finally established in 1979. In the world of science, the tornado sparked a renewed interest in meteorology. The U.S. Weather Bureau began funding research into severe storms, and universities started offering courses in atmospheric science. The first weather radar systems were developed in the 1940s, partly as a result of the lessons learned from the 1925 disaster. By the 1950s, the Weather Bureau had established a network of storm spotters who would report sightings of funnel clouds to local authorities. The first official tornado warning system was implemented in the 1960s, and by the 1970s, Doppler radar was being used to detect the rotation of supercell thunderstorms. All of these advances can be traced back in some small way to the day the sky turned green over the tri-state region. But for the survivors, the science and the policy changes were secondary. What mattered most was the day-to-day struggle to rebuild their lives. In the towns that had been destroyed, the process of rebuilding was slow and painful. Many families lived in tents or makeshift shacks for months, sometimes years, while they waited for their homes to be reconstructed. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, a constant reminder that the old life was gone and a new one was being built. Children played in the rubble, making up games with the broken pieces of their former homes. Parents worked from dawn until dusk, clearing debris, salvaging lumber, and planting new gardens. The schools reopened, first in temporary buildings, then in new structures that were designed to be safer and stronger. The teachers who had survived the tornado often found it difficult to return to the classroom. They looked at their students and saw the faces of the ones who had been lost. But they also saw the faces of the ones who had been spared, and that gave them the strength to continue. They taught the children how to read and write, but they also taught them how to be strong, how to face adversity, how to help each other. Those lessons stayed with the children for the rest of their lives. As the years passed, the survivors of the tri-state tornado began to grow old. They told their stories to their grandchildren, who listened with wide eyes, unable to fully comprehend the horror their elders had endured. The stories became family legends passed down from generation to generation. In Murfreesboro, the annual tornado anniversary was marked by a simple ceremony at the town square. A bell was rung once for each person who had died. The survivors would stand in silence, remembering. As the number of survivors dwindled, the ceremony became more poignant. There were fewer and fewer people who could say, "I was there, I remember." In the 1970s, a group of historians and meteorologists began compiling an oral history of the tri-state tornado. They interviewed dozens of survivors, recording their memories on tape. These recordings are now preserved in archives, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The interviews are filled with stories of heroism and sacrifice, of people helping each other in the midst of chaos. They also contain stories of loss and sorrow, of families torn apart, of lives cut short. But through it all, there is a thread of hope, a determination to go on. One of the most striking aspects of these oral histories is the way survivors described the tornado itself. They talked about the sound, which they said was like 1,000 freight trains or a roaring waterfall. They talked about the smell, which was like wet earth and electricity and something else they could not quite identify. They talked about the feel of the air, which was thick and heavy like a weight pressing down on them. And they talked about the light, which was greenish and eerie and unlike anything they had ever seen. For those who experienced it, the tornado was not just a weather event. It was a force of nature that seemed almost alive, a monster that had descended from the sky and devoured everything in its path. The scientific community eventually came to understand that the tri-state tornado was a rare phenomenon known as a tornado family, a series of tornadoes that occurred in succession along a single storm path. But for the people on the ground, it was all one event, one continuous nightmare. The tornado had traveled 219 miles, a distance that has never been equaled by any other tornado in recorded history. It was wide, sometimes more than a mile across, and it moved at speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. It was a perfect storm, a convergence of atmospheric conditions that occurs only once in a century, if that. In the 1950s, a young meteorologist named Ted Fujita began studying the tri-state tornado as part of his research into severe storms. Fujita would later become famous for developing the Fujita scale, which measures the intensity of tornadoes based on the damage they cause. He used the tri-state tornado as a case study, analyzing its path and behavior in meticulous detail. He concluded that the tornado had likely been an F5, the highest category on his scale, with winds exceeding 300 miles per hour. That finding has been debated by other meteorologists, but there is no doubt that the tri-state tornado was one of the most powerful and destructive tornadoes ever recorded. As the decades passed, the memory of the tornado began to fade from the national consciousness. New disasters captured the headlines: the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, the hurricanes that battered the Gulf Coast, the earthquakes that shook California. The tri-state tornado was studied by historians and meteorologists, but for the average American, it became a footnote, a page in a history book. But in the towns that had been hit, the memory never faded. It was woven into the fabric of the community, a part of the local identity. People who moved to Murfreesboro or West Frankfort or DeSoto learned about the tornado from their neighbors. They heard the stories at church picnics and town meetings. They saw the monuments and the plaques. They understood that they were living in a place that had been tested by fire, a place that had been broken and then rebuilt. And so when the sky turns green on a spring afternoon, when the air grows still and the birds stop singing, the people of the tri-state region know what to do. They go inside, they take cover, they remember, and they wait for the storm to pass, just as their grandparents did, just as their great-grandparents did on that terrible day in 1925. The tornado took so much from them, but it could not take their will to survive. That is the legacy of the tri-state tornado. That is the story that continues to be told year after year, generation after generation. And as long as the sky can turn green, as long as the wind can roar, that story will never be forgotten. But to say the story is never forgotten is not just a poetic sentiment. It is a fact of life in the towns that were shattered and rebuilt. In Murfreesboro, the Jackson County Historical Society maintains a permanent exhibit dedicated to the tornado. Visitors can see photographs of the devastation, personal belongings recovered from the rubble, and a detailed map of the tornado's path. There is a short film that plays on a loop featuring interviews with the last living survivors, their voices thin and trembling with age. The exhibit is small and quiet, tucked away in a corner of the building, but it draws a steady stream of visitors, especially in the spring. School children come on field trips, their teachers telling them to be respectful, to remember that real people died here. The children stand in front of the photographs and try to imagine what it must have been like, but they cannot. The black and white images make the disaster feel distant, like something that happened on another planet. But then they see the faces of the survivors, the same age as their own grandparents, and the distance collapses. In West Frankfort, the town built a memorial park on the site of the old high school, where so many had taken cover and so many had died. A granite obelisk stands in the center, inscribed with the names of the 450 people who lost their lives in Franklin County. Every year on March 18th, the townspeople gather at the park for a remembrance ceremony. They light candles. They read the names aloud one by one, a process that takes nearly an hour. The list includes entire families, The Smiths, the Johnsons, the Millers, their names carved into the stone in alphabetical order without distinction. The ceremony ends with a moment of silence, followed by the ringing of a bell. The bell is the same one that was used to call the volunteer firefighters on the day of the tornado. It was recovered from the rubble of the fire station, dented but still functional. It rings with a clear, resonant tone that carries across the park and into the streets beyond. Some of the older residents say they can still hear the screams if they listen closely enough, but they are the ones who were there. Their children hear only the bell. The Oral History Project that began in the 1970s has grown into a digital archive, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The recordings have been transcribed and annotated, cross-referenced with newspaper articles and Weather Bureau reports. Researchers from all over the world have used the archive to study everything from the psychology of disaster survivors to the development of emergency management protocols. One doctoral student from Japan wrote her dissertation on the role of community networks in the aftermath of the tornado, comparing the response in Murfreesboro to the response after the 1995 Kobe earthquake. She traveled to Illinois to interview the children of survivors, and she left with a new understanding of what it means to rebuild not just houses but trust. Another researcher, a meteorologist from Oklahoma, used the archive to refine his models of tornado behavior. He spent months analyzing the survivor descriptions of the cloud formations and the sequence of events, trying to match them with modern radar data from similar storms. His work led to a better understanding of how tornadoes form and dissipate, and it helped improve warning times for future generations. The survivors themselves, the few who remain, have become ambassadors of memory. They travel to schools and community centers, speaking to audiences of all ages. They do not charge a fee, they do it because they believe it is their duty. They stand at the podium, leaning on a cane or a walker, and they tell the story one more time. They describe the green sky and the roar, the fear that seized their hearts, the moments of sheer terror and unexpected kindness. They talk about the neighbor who carried a baby to safety, the stranger who dug someone out of the rubble with his bare hands, the dog that stayed by the side of its dead owner until help arrived. The audiences listen in silence. Some cry. Others ask questions afterward, wanting to know how they found the strength to go on. The survivors usually pause at that question, looking down at their hands. Then they say something like, "You just do, there's no other choice. You get up in the morning and you keep going." It is not a glamorous answer, but it is the truth. In the 21st century, new technologies have given the story of the tri-state tornado a second life. Documentaries have been produced, using computer-generated imagery to recreate the destruction. These films are shown on cable television and streaming services, reaching millions of viewers who had never heard of Murfreesboro or DeSoto. The tornado has become a subject of fascination for storm chasers and weather enthusiasts who travel to the tri-state region to stand on the same ground where the tornado passed. They take photographs of the farm fields and the small towns, trying to imagine what it must have looked like 100 years ago. They visit the cemeteries where the victims are buried, leaving flowers and notes. Some of them become obsessed, reading every book and article they can find, talking to local historians, making pilgrimages to the archives. They are drawn to the story not because they are morbid, but because it represents the ultimate test of human survival. They want to understand how ordinary people faced the extraordinary and lived to tell the tale. The legacy of the tri-state tornado is not only in the stories and the memorials. It is also in the way we build our communities. Building codes in the Midwest were changed after 1925, requiring stronger foundations, reinforced roofs, and safer construction techniques. Schools and public buildings were designed with interior hallways and basements that could serve as shelters. In some towns, new ordinances required that all new homes include a storm cellar or a safe room. These changes saved countless lives in later tornadoes, even if they could not prevent all damage. The lessons were hard-won, but they were applied. The same is true of emergency response. The Red Cross and other organizations developed standardized protocols for disaster relief, including the establishment of shelters, the distribution of food and water, and the coordination of search and rescue efforts. The National Weather Service, which replaced the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1970, continued to refine its forecasting and warning systems. By the time the tornado outbreak of 1974 struck, the death toll, though still high, was significantly lower than it might have been without the changes sparked by the tri-state disaster. But for all the progress, there is still a sense of vulnerability that lingers in the tri-state region. People here know that nature is indifferent. They know that no amount of preparation can guarantee safety. They know that a tornado can strike at any time without warning and turn their world upside down. That knowledge is a kind of wisdom, hard-earned and deeply felt. It shapes the way they live their lives. They keep their cell phones charged. They have a plan. They listen to the weather reports with an attention that outsiders might find excessive. They watch the sky on spring afternoons and they know the signs. They know that when the air becomes still and heavy, when the clouds take on a greenish tint, when the birds stop singing, it is time to take cover. They do not hesitate. They do not second guess. They move quickly calmly because they have been taught by the stories of their grandparents and great-grandparents. The stories are not just history. They are a manual for survival. In the end, the tri-state tornado is not a story about a storm. It is a story about people. It is a story about the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of communities, and the enduring power of memory. It is a story that reminds us that we are all vulnerable, but also that we are all capable of extraordinary courage. The tornado took lives, but it could not take the will to rebuild. It destroyed homes, but it could not destroy the bonds between neighbors. It left scars on the land and on the hearts of those who survived, but those scars are a testament to what was overcome. And so, as the years turn into decades and the decades into a century, the story continues to be told. It is told in the classrooms of Murfreesboro, in the archives of the Historical Society, in the documentaries that air on television, in the conversations between parents and children. It is told in the quiet moments when a survivor sits alone and remembers. It is told in the way the people of the tri-state region look at the sky, not with fear but with respect. They know what the sky can do, they have seen it, and they have survived it. That is the story, that is the legacy. And as long as the sky can turn green, as long as the wind can roar, that story will never be forgotten. It will be carried forward by those who hear it, passed down to those who come after, a reminder that even in the darkest hours there is light. The tri-state tornado of 1925 was one of the worst natural disasters in American history, but it also gave rise to some of the most remarkable acts of heroism and compassion. It changed the way we think about weather and safety, and it left behind a community that knows the true meaning of survival. That is why we remember. That is why we must never forget. There is a quiet danger in forgetting. When we let the stories fade, we lose not only the memory of those who died but the hard-earned wisdom that their suffering bought. The tri-state tornado taught us that nature does not care about our plans or our illusions of control. It taught us that the most important thing we can do is listen to each other, help each other, and never take for granted the simple gift of a safe morning. The survivors who still carry that lesson in their bones are fading now, one by one. Their voices are growing softer, their steps slower, their recollections sometimes tangled with the long years that have passed. But their message remains clear. We are all connected in the face of disaster, and the only way through is together. Consider the story of a young woman named Mary who was 19 when the tornado came to West Frankfort. She had just married her high school sweetheart, a coal miner named Ed. Their little house sat on a hill, and on that Wednesday afternoon Mary was inside ironing her husband's work shirts. She heard the roar, and she looked out the window and saw the sky turning that sick shade of green. She ran to the root cellar, but the handle was stuck. She prayed. She later said that she did not know the words of a formal prayer, so she just kept repeating, "Please, God, let me see Ed again." The tornado passed within 100 yards, tearing a neighboring house to splinters. Mary's house lost its roof and its front wall, but she was unharmed. Ed came home that evening, walking 12 miles from the mine, his face black with coal dust and tears. The first thing he said when he saw her was, "I thought I'd have to dig you out." They lived in that house for another 50 years. Mary never ironed when the sky looked strange again. She would always pause, look out the window, and say, "Green sky means trouble." That small habit, born from a single moment of terror, passed to her children and her grandchildren. It is a tiny ritual of vigilance, a quiet memorial that lives on in the daily actions of a family. In the town of Griffin, Indiana, the tornado claimed an entire family of 7. They were the Barlows, a farming family who had lived in the same house for 3 generations. Edward Barlow, the father, had been a Civil War veteran. He had survived battles that killed thousands, only to be taken by a storm that lasted less than 10 minutes. His wife Sarah was found with her arms wrapped around her 2 youngest children, as if she had been trying to shield them to the very end. The story of the Barlows became a symbol of the tornado's indiscriminate cruelty, but it also became a symbol of how a community can honor its dead. Every year on the anniversary of the tornado, a local farmer named David Barlow, a descendant of Edward's brother, placed a small American flag on the family's grave. He did this for 70 years. When he died, his son took over. The tradition continues to this day. It is a private ritual known only to a few neighbors, but it matters. It says we have not forgotten. It says you were here, you lived, you mattered. The tornado also reshaped the way we think about disaster preparedness in a broader sense. In the years following 1925, the American Red Cross developed a new model for emergency response, one that emphasized coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. The old model had been based on charity and ad hoc volunteer efforts. After the tri-state disaster, the Red Cross realized that such a chaotic response could not handle the scale of a catastrophe that spanned multiple states. They created a system of disaster relief that included trained volunteers, pre-positioned supplies, and a chain of command that could be activated within hours. That system was tested again in the Great Floods of 1927 and the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s. Each time, it improved. By the time the tornado outbreak of 1965 struck the Midwest, the Red Cross was able to set up shelters and distribute food within hours of the storms. Lessons from Murfreesboro and DeSoto and West Frankfort had been absorbed, but the most profound change may have been in the area of forecasting and warning. In 1925, there was no way to warn people that a tornado was coming. The Weather Bureau had issued a general forecast of thunderstorms, but that was all. Tornadoes were not even a part of the official weather vocabulary. The word itself was rarely used in public communications because officials feared that it would cause panic. After the tri-state disaster, that attitude began to shift. Meteorologists started to study tornadoes with a new urgency. They gathered eyewitness accounts, plotted the path of the storm, and tried to understand the conditions that had produced it. In 1948, the first tornado forecast was made by Air Force meteorologists at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, a direct result of the knowledge gained from the tri-state experience. By the 1950s, the Weather Bureau had begun issuing tornado watches. The first practical warning system, using radar and spotter networks, was established in the 1960s. And in 1974, when a series of tornadoes killed more than 300 people across the South and Midwest, the death toll would have been far higher without those advances. The tri-state tornado also changed the way we talk about disaster. Before 1925, news coverage of tornadoes was often brief, local, and quickly forgotten. The tri-state storm was different. Because it crossed 3 states and killed so many, it became a national story. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried detailed accounts. Photographs of the destruction were published in magazines and later in books. The event entered the American consciousness as a cautionary tale. It was used in schools to teach about weather and disaster preparedness. It was referenced in sermons, in political speeches, in stories passed down through families. It became part of the cultural DNA of the Midwest. That is why, even a century later, people in that part of the country still know what a green sky means. It is why they still tell their children to go to the basement when the wind picks up. It is why they still remember the names of towns like Murfreesboro and DeSoto and Griffin, places that might otherwise be just dots on a map. And yet, there is a melancholy truth that those of us who study the history of disasters must face. No matter how much we prepare, no matter how many lessons we learn, nature will always have the upper hand. The tri-state tornado was not the last great tornado to strike the Midwest. In 1953, the Waco tornado killed 114 people. In 1965, the Palm Sunday outbreak killed 271. In 1974, the super outbreak killed 315. In 2011, the Joplin tornado killed 158. Each of these events brought new lessons, new changes to building codes, new improvements to warning systems. But each one also reminded us that you cannot outrun a storm. You can only try to be ready. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the tri-state tornado is the humility it instilled in the people who lived through it and in the generations that followed. They know that the weather is not something to be conquered. It is something to be respected. They know that the most advanced radar in the world cannot predict every tornado. They know that the safest basement cannot protect you from everything. And so they live with a kind of quiet acceptance, a willingness to face the worst without succumbing to despair. That is the gift that the survivors pass down. It is not a lesson you can learn from a textbook. It is a lesson you learn from standing in the ruins of your home, looking at the sky, and deciding to rebuild anyway. There is a story that the Historical Society in Murfreesboro likes to tell. It is about a woman named Clara who was 8 years old when the tornado struck. She lost both her parents and her younger brother. She was found alive, buried under a mattress with only a few scratches. She was taken in by an aunt who lived in a nearby town. Clara grew up, married, had children, and lived a long life. She never spoke about the tornado. Not to her children, not to her husband, not to anyone. It was only in her 90s, when a researcher came to interview her, that she finally broke her silence. She described the sound of the train. She described the feeling of the mattress pressing down on her. She described the silence that came after and the sound of a single bird singing. And then she said, "I never told anyone because I didn't want them to know how afraid I was. I didn't want them to think I was weak, but I'm old now and I don't care anymore. I was afraid, I was so afraid, but I survived." The researcher asked her if she had any advice for people today. Clara thought for a long time, then she said, "Be kind to each other, that's all. Because when the storm comes, and it will come, you will need each other." She died a few months later at the age of 98. Her story, like so many others, is now part of the archive. The archive itself continues to grow. New donations come in every year, old photographs found in attics, letters that had been tucked away in Bibles, oral histories recorded on cassette tapes from decades ago. The Historical Society in Murfreesboro has digitized many of these materials, making them available online. Researchers from around the world can now access the documents without leaving their desks. But there is still something irreplaceable about visiting the archive in person. Standing in that small room, surrounded by the yellowed newspapers and the faded photographs, you can feel the weight of history. You can imagine the people who once held those letters, who once looked at those photographs, who once walked those streets. It is a sacred space not because of the building itself, but because of what it contains, the voices of the dead preserved for the living. Every few years, a local newspaper runs an article about the tornado, usually around the anniversary. The article will include a few statistics, a few quotes from survivors, a photograph of the memorial. The readers who grew up in the area already know the story, but they read it anyway. It is a ritual like lighting a candle. It is a way of saying we have not forgotten. And for those who are new to the area, the article is an introduction, a reminder that the ground they walk on has been soaked with tears and blood and sweat. It is a history lesson that comes without a test, but it stays with you. In the end, all of this is what it means to remember. It is not just about dates and numbers, though those matter. It is about the stories. It is about the woman who survived because a mattress saved her, and the man who walked 12 miles to find his wife alive, and the farmer who placed a flag on a grave for 70 years. It is about the children who grew up hearing those stories and who now tell them to their own children. It is about the researcher who spent months studying the cloud formations and the documentary filmmaker who spent years gathering footage. It is about every person who has ever paused on a spring afternoon to look at the sky, feeling a chill of recognition, knowing that the same sky that brings sunshine and gentle rain can also bring a storm of unimaginable fury. That knowledge is a burden, but it is also a gift. It keeps us humble. It keeps us connected. It reminds us that we are not alone. The Tri-State Tornado of 1925 was not the deadliest tornado in American history in terms of sheer numbers, but it was the deadliest in a different sense. It was the one that showed us the limits of our power and the depth of our vulnerability. It was the one that forced us to change the way we build, the way we warn, the way we respond. It was the one that gave us the stories that still echo today, a century later. And as those stories continue to be told, the tornado will never truly die. It will live on in the memory of a nation, a reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not the wind, but the human will to survive. That is the legacy. That is the story. That is why we remember. That is why we must never forget.